You're listening to the Valley Current.
Hey, Tom. There you are. You got some serious headphone microphone combination going on there.
Yeah, well, it's been zooming through the day.
I bet.
Yeah.
It's a new world.
Yes.
It's not changing back to the old way. It doesn't seem like it's ever going to change back, Tom.
You know, I actually think the eclipse was the deity's way of saying, okay, now I'm going to pay attention.
We had a total eclipse today. It had a lot of fanfare because there were people that were doing airline trips to see the eclipse through an airline seat. I'd never heard of that before, but there are people that bought plane tickets to get over to Dallas. I guess Dallas was a good place in the U.S. to see it. You had to have special glasses, which I did have, and I did view it. It was partial. What I saw was partial. And I guess if you were in Dallas, you could do the full eclipse. And of course, CNN had a big story running about how people took the day off or the afternoon off and made a party out of it, right? That's what we do as Americans.
You had the Indianapolis Speedway, where 40,000 new best friends all looked at it together and then partied.
It created tonight, right? From people that meet each other on a day of an eclipse, and all of a sudden it's like, yeah, you know, this is what happened. We met each other at an eclipse party, right?
My oldest nephew was what we call here in Massachusetts a blizzard baby. A blizzard of 78.
Right.
Nobody could go outside. They begat my nephew Jay.
Well, you know, that's people talk about kind of things that change things, right? I was in New York during one of the blackouts, and then 9 months later, people were talking about what happened in that New York City blackout. I forget when it happened. It was a while ago. I want to say it was in the 1980s.
Yeah, I think it was.
The city just went completely to zero. The whole grid came down.
Well, we're living in interesting times.
I mean, back then that was unheard of, but I think today we kind of would accept that there could be rolling blackouts, right?
I think we were more tolerant of it.
Actually, it's 1977 is what they're saying. I'm just looking at the day the world turned upside down. New York City's, I remember this, 1977 blackout, jumpstart the hip hop era. That was wild.
Thank you again for having me on.
Yeah, well, you're generating some really interesting stuff, and we of course get to see it because you sent it to us pre-release, and that leads to kind of an interesting question: is it worthy of a podcast? And it always is. But I always ask you if you want to do it, and you said, "Yeah, this is a good one." And you've got a team of people at Discussion Partners that are constantly thinking about new topics and coming up with great ideas. So tell us more about this month's version then.
Well, this one came about, Jack, you know, candidly, because of one of my clients' frustrations.
Mm-hmm.
And as I said to you when we corresponded, after President Biden's State of the Union address, I received a call from this conservative Republican who was incensed that former President Trump imitated President Biden's stutter, and people laughed.
Right.
And I was reminded that you and I had done a podcast in October.
Right.
And out your way, there was a similar situation where there was comments about Nancy Pelosi's husband being assaulted.
Right.
And he was being sarcastic, and people laughed. And the combination of that plus the mimicking of the reporter who was handicapped, and again people laughed, became very troubling in aggregation
Right.
to us.
Right.
Now, circling back to this CEO, he was enraged,
Mm-hmm.
and he voted for former President Trump twice.
Right.
But he also, as a child, stuttered.
Mm-hmm.
That was it for him. That was his red line. And more than the crassness was the laughter, because he remembered being laughed at. And when we looked at a number of the comments from the research we had done starting in Labor Day, the underlying thematics was we have lost our ability to have reasonably polite interactions. Now we can point to January 6th, and we can point to the Republican debates of 2015. But the short answer is for the last period of time, the arena for rudeness has become our political environment. And it seems to be getting worse. And it's not that people don't notice. In some cases, the political discourse is bringing out the worst of us. In other cases, it's offending us. But in all cases, it's polarizing us.
Yeah, I want to make a comment here, because when I was in law school, and I remember as a young associate, there was this very civil aspect to doing civil litigation, as a criminal litigation as well. But basically, there was a code of civility that lawyers operated on. And, this was back in the day when people used to smoke during depositions. I used to even smoke in some courthouses, particularly courthouses in the South. And it was a very civil, sort of genteel way of doing business with the opposing counsel, even in a lawsuit. And of course, in transactions, it was always super civil. Like there was always a degree of, this is all about trust and we're making a fair transaction. No one's trying to take advantage. Everyone's being upfront. And then something happened, and I don't know when it happened, but it happened a number of years, some would even say decades ago, where it became like a food fight. And people would argue over the most ridiculous stuff. And judges just became inflamed that lawyers were being no longer civil in depositions. They were making loud objections. They were calling each other names. Like, it's terrible. So what they did, what the bar did, and more than just California, all over the United States, the bar said, look, we want to reinstitute this notion of civility, and there's going to be some really harsh sanctions if we see any abusive conduct. And I don't know if it really improved things. I think probably the ABA, the American Bar Association, would say, yeah, there's been improvements. But by and large, in the Zoom era, when people are not really able to get the body language across as well, there can be some very shrill moments. And now people are talking about, well, maybe we should actually sanction what are called micro expressions or microaggressions. Some people even call them micro assaults. And they argue certain things that happen on Zoom are really improper. And I just laugh because I'm from Brooklyn. I'm from New York, grew up in Brooklyn, born in Queens. We were used to getting kind of critiqued and pushed around and, sort of in your face kind of stuff. But there's almost this interesting pendulum that's playing out. And I wonder if the business side is sort of is behind, like the legal side had it first and then they swung back. And now the business side or the political side is motivating the business side, because the political side just seems over the top. It seemed over the top for me for a while.
I'm the oldest of 7 in an American Irish family.
Right.
I don't remember family dinners as being models of decorum.
Mm-hmm.
And if you didn't have fast elbows, there may be no potatoes by the time the dish got to you.
Right.
To the point where my parents would eat by themselves. My mother would serve the table and then leave the room. And then they would eat later. In which there were other reasons for that, not the least of which is they were getting caught up.
Mm-hmm.
But what I think is happening in the very recent past, and as you know, Jack, from our discussions, is we're trying to figure out why people are behaving the way they are, in the hopes that there's some insights we can share with our clients in terms of leadership. And what we're really sensing is a meltdown. In the political arena, words like vermin, detention camps, when there's threats to imprison media personalities who are critique, and you have the president of the United States, not the first time, being accused of a liar, and the then Speaker of the House having to go shush because it happens so frequently. This gentleman who contacted us, he essentially said, "Do you guys have anything on bullying?"
Yeah.
And it was
topic.
Yeah, we were. You sometimes want to elevate the conversation, and you want to get philosophical about it, and you could reasonably say that the politicians who were oppressors, i.e. bullies, over the last 100 years, I think the only one who died in bed was Stalin.
Mm-hmm.
The others met less elegant ends.
Right.
But if you just look at it in terms of the leadership behaviors, it's just hit the end of the line. In other words, people may not confront their leaders, but they really are looking at them like they're baboons.
Well, I don't think Biden did himself a favor. Did you think he did himself a favor with how shrill he was at that State of the Union? Because I was surprised when I tuned into it. I was like, wow, what did they decide to amp him up by like 10x compared to what he usually was, right?
I think one person's shrillness is another person's high energy.
Yeah, high energy.
Okay. And I think
felt pretty loud to me.
I think that he had to do something because of all of the accusations of it. He may have been a little over the top.
Right.
But then again, let's look at the House of Commons in England.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Or during the political debates in Canada.
Right.
So he's not insulting people.
Right.
And being in a blue state, I'm going to have to give him a pass because I was glad to see the energy.
No, the energy was there, but I was sort of wondering, what would somebody comparing his normal situation to that situation side by side do in terms of saying, well, he's been instructed that he's got to look like a powerful, strong man because the tilt of the world is going for strong men. And then the stuff that I'm reading recently, which I know you're going to say that's crazy shit that you read, Jack, but I read a whole gamut of stuff. And the latest stuff that's coming out of the Republican side of things, or maybe even what I would call the libertarian side of things, is that there's this big plan to put Michelle Obama in as the nominee for president in August at the convention. And Biden's going to say, yeah, I've had enough of this. This is just too much. And my health is not great. But there's a great candidate here named Michelle Obama. And she's going to bring a lot of talent to the table because she is well liked and she does poll well. And she is a woman and she's Black and she's Barack Obama's wife. And, they're in Washington, D.C. still. And of course, you could say it's crazy making, but I would imagine that there's got to be a backup plan. And I don't know of any better backup plan. And I'm a Democrat and I vote Democrat down the line. But I think it kind of makes sense if you look at it. Now, I know she has said she has no interest in politics, but she wrote a couple of books. They sold pretty well. She looks great. She looks pretty young. She looks younger, way younger than Barack Obama looks, that's for sure. It's kind of a 2-for-1 in a way to have a wife of a president. I mean, wouldn't that be a first for us?
It would be a first on so many levels I can't even count. But
a woman, a black woman, a wife of a successful black man president, first black man president. I mean, it's a lot of boxes that it clicks, and it doesn't do any injustice to Kamala Harris because it's a black woman. I mean, you can't say that somehow she was replaced by someone that was, a white male or something, right?
Well, I think that, and even though we're talking about bullying and talking about a lack of respectful discourse,
right?
And frankly, we're talking about abuse and aggression. Right. I don't think abandoning the faith in the political process is where I want to start.
Okay.
There were primaries. These are the two gentlemen who are going to get better for their rematch. And I obviously have a favorite in this. And I do not hold a lot of warm fuzzies towards the former president, particularly after January 6th.
Right.
However, the process is the processes. But if we think about the process and outcome of how the communication is deteriorated, that's where the bullying piece comes in. I don't think that we can ignore it because I do think that it's an underlying tension in addition to the styles of the candidates and in addition to the policy positions that they would take. Jack, after this gentleman kind of made a request because of the offense that he took.
Mm-hmm.
Back in 2016, we began doing interviews with executives on was there anything that they had done that they were ashamed of and they would never want to see their children or their grandchildren do.
Right.
And we had people talking about they had stolen as a child. They had contributed to a suicide.
Ouch.
They realized that they had become a racist. The one that was fascinating to me was the chapter that we wrote on bullying. It was actually my son.
Mm-hmm.
And back when we were working on the book, I was having dinner with he and his wife and their two children boys, both of them now 6'4" and 6'5" and black belts. Mm. Back then they were a lot tinier. Mm-hmm. But I was talking about how was I going to find an executive who would acknowledge that I was a bully. And my son, stepson, this happened before I came into his life, acknowledged that he and a friend teased this young man named Billy when he was in like second, third grade. And the Billy changed schools for other reasons, but that was part of it. And years later, when he was just in high school, he was approached by a friend saying, Billy is looking for you. And he closes his locker one day, and Billy had gotten big.
Scared big.
Billy, Billy made his presence felt, through the intimidation of size. And as my stepson said, he just wanted to survive until first period. Now he's gone into teaching, and he teaches in middle school, and he's allowed his story to be used. And when he talks to his students who he sees laying hands on each other, he tells the Billy story. Mm-hmm. So he uses himself as an example. And when the book came out, the market for the book was actually schools. And when we would be out there speaking, it was usually in middle to high schools, junior highs. And we would start the question and said, okay, who in the class is a bully?
Mm-hmm.
And nobody would raise their hand, but everybody would start pointing.
Right.
The question becomes, nobody came out of the womb being a bully.
Right.
Where did they learn it? Why did they learn it? And why do they continue to do it? Now, if you fast forward to where we are as adults and try to ask and answer the question, how in a commercial setting or in the political setting, when these types of behaviors, abusive, sarcastic, punishing, and they continue to be promoted and not checked, and if anything, encouraged. How do we as leaders look?
Encouraged. I think you're right. It was encouraged.
Well, you look at January 6th. I mean, that's the best example. People who were armed arrived looking to wreak havoc, right. Encouraged to wreak havoc, and did. Now, despite all of the revisionist history about taking tours of the Capitol while screaming to hang Mike Pence, the reality is we didn't look very good. It was very reminiscent of what happened in France, that brought about their revolution. Fortunately, we don't have guillotines, so we'd probably be using them. But at the same time, as leaders, we really look stupid if we can't control that type of behavior. And the other part, it's not just limited to what we say, how we say it. The part that really got our attention when we started looking into this book and writing about it, and the sentiments that are being expressed to us, particularly when we're working with high potentials, mm-hmm. is the fact that it's okay. Even worse, it's a foundation to laugh, which is so offensive to so many people. Now that's the discourse. That's how we're observed. And then let's look at it in terms of the bullying situation that is accelerated via social media. There was a study done in a psychiatric journal about a year ago that said about 15% of those people who were the target of this book we wrote, the age of 12 to 18, that if we take that age cohort, it's almost 15% of it said they had been bullied on social media. And it was approximately the same percent in the study that came out a year ago that had contemplated suicide or self-harm. As somebody who just hit their 74th candle, mm-hmm. I'm starting to get a little pessimistic that if we don't start checking our stupidity at the door and relegate bulliness and appreciation of the bully to the parking lot someplace, it's only going to get worse. So, because we're 8 months away from an election, and there's been no restraint so far.
No, I think it's going to get far worse, and it's amped up by both social media and the news cycle. Mm-hmm. Folks who love capturing a soundbite or two when crazy, nutty stuff happens. But I want to do a comparison, because when I read your draft article that's coming out shortly, I thought to myself, remember Lyndon Baines Johnson as a president and some of his, quote, negotiation styles? And when you look at those pictures, and I tried to find some, and the ones that are coming up are not as good as the ones I remember, but maybe I'm misremembering, where he has this kind of in-your-face look to him. Like if you look at how he goes nose to nose, these are some of the stock photos that are on Google Images. The Johnson treatment explained, he gets real close up front with people's faces, face to face. This is the famous one, where he's leaning over on someone. Like literally, there's a shorter guy. I don't know who the guy is, but basically, I don't know if you could see these photos, but they're on what I call, the search was LBJ negotiation styles, because I don't think he was ever accused of bullying. You know, the picture I think of is this one where this guy is almost back on his heels, but he's sort of smiling at him. He's sort of smiling at him. You know, he's sort of like, you know, I know this is your style, Lyndon. I know you like to get in people's faces. That's okay. I can accept it. And, you know, I don't know if that worked, but there are people that claim that he was really good at delivering influence and getting people to change their minds or to move in a certain direction. Obviously, he passed the Civil Rights Act, and that was something that had been stalled for a while under Kennedy. And he did it, and he did a lot of stuff. And there's a lot of pictures of him really being in the face. And I imagine he was pretty good at what he did. And I can't find the other one that I'm thinking about. There's lots of pictures and stock photos, but it was never stated that he was a bully. And yet in today's world, I think if you tried to get that close up with someone, they would immediately call it an assault. I mean, it wouldn't even be bullying. It would be an outright, you know, civil, if not criminal assault, because you're literally getting them to be back on their heels. Maybe it's a different era, right? Maybe we're in a different era, or maybe Lyndon had a way of making people feel comfortable. He was a big guy. And if you look at how close up front he is to people, I mean, you don't see people like doing that these days. And certainly if it was a female, there's no way he could get away with doing that. Maybe not even back in that era, back in those.
Well, I'm going to compare my son to Lyndon Johnson. You know, when he was teasing his friend, he didn't think of it as bullying.
Right.
He just thought of it as teasing.
Right.
You know, and Johnson did leverage his size.
Right.
When he was in the Senate.
Right.
When he was a big man, and he would get right in your face. There's a psychological aspect called conversational distance,
right?
And he invaded it. You know, I mean, he set up his campsite way too close. But one of the things that I also noticed is the politicians of the day, when they would shake their hand, shake your hand.
Right.
They would pull you towards you.
Right. Right. That doesn't happen anymore. That doesn't
Senator
happen.
Senator Kennedy, you know, I could tell you what type of mouthwash you would use.
Right.
You know? But, you know, he would pull you close. This was just the way it was.
Right.
And I don't think it was intended to intimidate, although it probably did. It's different now. Okay, it's not a political style. It is intended to insult and hurt. It's intended.
You're saying it doesn't have that sense of friendship behind it. I win, you lose. You win, I lose.
Well, I think that it's a little bit taking the metaphor, Jack. In order for me to win, you have to lose. And I have to humiliate you in the process of you losing. Okay. And, you know, when Johnson never called Barry Goldwater Sleepy Battery. It's just different now. We can go back and compare the political figures, but if we're dealing with the here and now, it just feels like we're out of control.
And it's going to get worse because we've got the former president who feels like he has to amplify everything. And we've got, people wanting to believe that a strongman approach in a world of Putins and other strongmen makes sense. So you can see that there's got to be this picture of strength in our leader. And yet, when I think of some other great presidents like FDR, I don't think of FDR as someone that ever really bullied anyone. And he was pretty forceful. He was pretty forceful in the way he delivered his speeches.
You knew what these gentlemen, and frankly, the women that were in the political milieu, the Margaret Smiths, the others that are role models now for women who are in Congress,
Mm-hmm.
they knew how to behave. They knew how to lobby. They knew how to fight. But everything was tactics.
Right.
And everything was relationship. Everything was principles. It wasn't insulting. It wasn't abuse. The culmination of this is that we've been talking about internally within the discussion partner community is people have started getting hurt. Blowing over 4 police officers committed suicide subsequent to January 6th. We don't hear about that. We don't hear enough about the threats that have been made at the local levels of murder, okay, or physical harm. We're aware of it, okay, but unless we start waking up and pushing back when somebody, whether it's President or former President Trump or Mr. Potato Head, as soon as they start insulting people, let's not give them the courtesy of laughing.
Right.
Let's start maybe booing a little. If not, we're just encouraging this bullying behavior.
Right.
Jack, we've known each other for a while, and I have a fairly interesting background. It's not the bullying words or the manifestations of pretending to stutter. It's the laughter. That's the part that scares the shit on me. Because there's nothing friggin' funny about it.
Well, you're saying there's a shift in culture to the point where instead of having some degree of shame leveled at the bullier, it's sort of like banter and, carry on. This is what we're accepting. It's entertaining and we expect it and we applaud it. And it's viewed as a strength as opposed to weakness. Look, when I grew up Catholic, of course, Catholic grade school, Catholic high school, very strict. The view was you persuaded with reasoning. You didn't persuade with shrill criticism or, ad hominem attacks. And in fact, if you did the latter, you must have been pretty insecure about your reasoning. And most judges will say the same thing. They will say, if you have to stoop to an ad hominem attack, you must not have much of a case because that's just not going to be persuasive. And they have their antennae out all the time for chinks in the chain of logic. And when they see people go low or hit below the belt, it's a signal that there must be some weakness in the actual presentation. And so staying above the belt and staying at a higher level of abstraction is what scores points with most judges, most appellate panels, probably all judges, all appellate panels. No judge wants to see lawyers hitting below the belt and doing, stuff that is repugnant. And it's shocking to me, the stuff that Trump is doing in New York to this New York judge and his family is just shocking to me. And that the entire ABA has not stood up and said, this is inappropriate and it has to stop. I mean, if he were a lawyer, Trump would be disbarred. If he were a lawyer doing the stuff he's doing, he would be disbarred. There'd be no question about it. And that the ABA is not coming out and saying some stuff like that is unfortunate, because you could argue they should be, in a very unified way, trying to say this is not the right role model for the future leaders that we want to have, who will come to court with certain expectations and will either want to be judges or not want to be judges. And look, if a judge's family is going to be attacked, that candidate who becomes or could become a judge is going to think twice about whether or not it makes sense to become a judge, because it's
absolutely,
it's like making a target out of your entire family. It's a shame.
I've been associated with the military for decades. My wife grew up in Peru in a dictatorship. I was on an expatriate assignment when Hugo Chavez attempted his first coup and then was elected when he came out of prison. So the behaviors of people who use force instead of persuasion,
mm-hmm.
and people who leverage their role or their size, that's been with us forever. But the laughter part,
mm-hmm.
we're not talking Don Rickles, but
careful.
We're not talking about somebody who's doing it humor.
Right.
We're not talking about somebody who's doing it, frankly, in a respectful way. We're talking about people who think this is the way to please people. And if they are that insecure, get a therapist. But don't put other people in jeopardy, like this young woman who happens to be the daughter of a judge in New York.
Right.
Or these two, the ones that drove Rudy Giuliani into bankruptcy, the mother and the daughter, who they lived under death threats. There's no way this can be okay. And as older leaders, commercial, political, anybody of influence, we just need to start saying that's unacceptable.
Yeah, and you have to wonder, how would you try to get that new civility plan to happen? Because I could tell you the business schools are sensitive and are doing what they call now microaggression training. That is, on Zoom, there are things that you might do that you might even not be sensitive that you're doing, and that will be interpreted as a form of microaggression. And I had a case recently, just as a footnote, I had a case recently in which an executive was fired, and it's an executive that was in his 50s. He was dealing with a startup. He was brought in to help organize a startup. He was not brought in as CEO. There was a young founder CEO. It was more like the COO. And I'll leave all the names out to protect the innocent. Mm-hmm. And he was on a Zoom thing, and on the Zoom thing, he likes to use football analogies. And the all hands Zoom meeting was like 15 people in the I'll call it the extended C-suite. The startup was pretty well funded, and it needed someone to sort of organize it, because the CEO was not really good at that part of the leadership. And this guy was using a football analogy. What happened was, apparently there were 5 or 6 women on that Zoom who were running some sort of side chat thing in WhatsApp or some other, these days Zooms are not just what's happening on the Zoom. There's like all this other texting going on. Can you believe that? Like private texting going on. So 5 or 6 women were in some private chat room saying, can you believe that? He's using a football analogy where it's male football players, and he's talking about, we got to get out there and tackle and get yards and do this and do that. And he's not even sensitive that we're on this call. And I'll tell you, he got fired a day after that Zoom, because those 5 or 6 women all wrote some remarks that they thought what he was doing. Now, I haven't seen the transcript. They say it's recorded, the video's recorded. And of course, the guy's like, I've done this at every company. It's like the Joe Lombardi story. It's what I do. I'm in my 50s. It's what I use. And they were offended. And I don't know what the exact words were, but it was a very male, I'm sure, discussion of This is what we need to do to win. A lot of football analogy stuff. And he was so upset because he didn't see it coming. And yet, if you run that story, and you'd have to have the video to test it, there would be a lot of people that would say, in today's world on Zoom, if you're not fully sensitive to the totality of your audience, now I don't know how you get the right permissions. Can I use a football analogy? Do you mind that I'm going to talk about male football players? I mean, it's not the way I want to live, that you have to do all that throat clearing. But, maybe that's where we're going, that people can be offended by even very small things. And I'm not saying any of the Trump stuff is justified, because this is at the other end of the spectrum. This guy, in good faith, was trying to get this team motivated. He decided to use football. Maybe he needs to use women's soccer. I don't know what he could have used. But he got fired, and he felt like there was an age discrimination that occurred, that effectively he was being cast out as being kind of the older, guy from the 1980s, that we're in the 2020s, and he's way out of sync with where we need to be. And he felt like he was discriminated against based on his age. So it was a weird thing, because they felt like somehow he was offending them, and he felt like they were offending him. Because this is where I wanted to go with this. Imagine when people are living to 100 and maybe working until 90, and they're working with maybe 5 other generations that are in their, maybe even their teens. Maybe someone is 18 and a worker might be 88, and there might be in between 5 other generations. How do you imagine that multi-generation workforce being able to communicate with each other without breaking a lot of glass, or potentially breaking a lot of glass? Because I'm not saying it's undoable, but man, the line gets less and less certain. It seems like every year it gets less and less certain.
The way we've been approaching it in the recent past, the behaviors are the behaviors, the words are the words.
Mm-hmm.
And the reactions, if confronted, is the best approach. One of my more embarrassing stories, before I went into consulting, I was in the not-for-profit area.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a social service agency that I headed up. There was 100% women but me, and I was the boss.
How I feel when I'm in these yoga classes with like 25 women, I'm the only guy.
Well, this was a large association, Jake, that almost 150 women,
Mm-hmm.
and I had an all hands, and I kept using the word guys.
Ooh, that'll get you a big demerit.
This was in the 70s.
Mm-hmm.
This was in the 70s, and I was the boss.
Right.
I was the guy. I was the executive director. And one of the women raised her hand and says, "Tom, you're the only guy here." Okay. Now, I was not intending to be insulting.
Right.
I was using the nomenclature.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
And problem that we have is there's a reluctance to confront. But most people, once confronted, will be mindful of the fact, well, geez, that was stupid.
Right.
Which is how I felt.
Right.
But Jack, I think the gentleman has a point without knowing what the specifics were.
Mm-hmm.
The concern I would have is if we're thinking about the difference between unintentionally insulting people
Mm-hmm.
versus overtly
Right.
bullying or insulting,
Right.
in order to diminish somebody
Mm-hmm.
or hurt somebody in furtherance of your own objectives.
Right.
That is the part of the behavior that I think is getting out of hand.
And your point is, what's getting out of hand is that the choir that's listening to it doesn't protest and call them on it. Instead, they laugh it off, and they sort of end up supporting it, which adds fuel to the fire of, hey, I made them laugh. That's good, right? That's a positive thing, right?
But what we're struggling with, and I know we'll be running out of time, is which one is the disease?
Right.
The bullier or the people who laugh at them?
Well, you could argue the people that laugh at them are enablers, and the bullier is getting further enabled by the enablers, and maybe the super enablers are the social media channels, and the super enablers are the CNNs and the MSNBCs and the Fox News and all of the various 7x24 channels that love to play the clips, because it's the clips that kind of create news, and the news keeps getting more and more shrill.
Answer this hypothetical question. If former President Trump was mimicking Joe Biden's stutter and nobody laughed, would he have understood?
That's a different issue. He may not be able to be even conscious of what he does, but at some point, I guess if he got booed enough and got booed off the stage enough, if that really played out with enough frequency.
Now take it a little bit further. That's one example. If you're in a room and somebody is bullying somebody and you say, "Stop it," what happens?
You get chastised like it's none of your business, right? I mean, it's
possible,
right? It's got to be like
possible.
group. It's got to almost be like a group response of inappropriateness that causes some behavior change and maybe even an apology, right? In the ideal,
which is where we ended up. The independent of the laughter, just stopping the laughter, that doesn't solve the problem.
Right.
There has to be a willingness to confront the behavior.
Right. And at some level, you could argue this notion of civility or super civility has to start pretty early, and it has to continue in some way to sort of recreate itself over and over again. And in Washington, D.C., the opposite is playing out over and over again. The opposite is playing out like every day of the week. The opposite's playing out over and over again.
It's not only politics that is playing out in business, is playing out in interactions, personal interactions, relationships.
Right.
And the concern that we have, just based on the clients we talk to, the research we've been doing, is it's the unwillingness to confront that is the biggest problem.
I don't know how you change that, because you'd have to get some role models and influencers. Like, look, the thing I laugh about is kind of a footnote to the story, but maybe I shouldn't laugh, is Angelina Jolie is in a 7.5-year property settlement battle with Brad Pitt. It was in the news today because they're levying some huge fights over whether certain documents should be produced for this chateau, this vineyard that they co-own 50-50. It's been in the news for a while, but they've been in this fight over the control of this vineyard in France for like 7.5 years. And two big New York law firms are running this case, which is in the courts, in the state courts in Los Angeles, in California. These lawyers don't even have offices in California. They use local counsel. So it's these New York firms, and they have like 5 or 6 lawyers on each masthead. We were trying to calculate, as a joke today, we were trying to calculate what they must be charging these people. And I made the joke, and maybe it was inappropriate. I said, I think they're just generating the movie script for Mr. and Mrs. Smith Go to Court, the film that the two of them did.
Well, I can't wait for now that Succession has gone away,
right?
The book Unscripted, Out Your Way and Succession Plan,
right?
Becoming a miniseries,
right.
But to pivot to where you and I have been talking back channels. The thing is that the words "all politics is local,"
Mm-hmm.
I think is the way we need to think about it, because it's really unraveling. And when younger generations, I'm looking at my 4 grandchildren and others, and the younger folks that are in our high potential development, they're just disgusted. Okay. And if we're ever in a position, and we usually are at some point, to just say, that's unacceptable, at least that's a start.
Right. I agree with you. And I just wonder, like, just to play out where we go in the next 6 months, because I have to tell you, I'm not looking for, I still get paper newspapers. Of course, it's probably not the most green thing to do, but I like to see the whole newspaper. I like to see the layout. I like to compare the New York Times headline with the Washington Post headline, with the FT headline, with the Wall Street Journal headline. Usually it's a very same topic, but the headline has its own little spin to it. And I have to tell you, I've been noticing, even in the way the headlines are presented, that there's a certain degree of shrillness to get people's attention. And that's like a hammer that keeps hammering away, that says this is the mode of operating. The mode of operating is you have to use a hammer. Everything is a nail. You have to use Maslow's hammer to hammer a point in. And all these newspapers are doing it. Of course, the newspapers are getting thinner and thinner because there isn't as much advertising. Magazines are getting thinner and thinner. I sort of sometimes do the cross-reference to The Economist and other magazines as I cross-compare. Mm-hmm. And I say to myself, all of this is leading to a society that starts with a very adversarial approach to everything, as opposed to a much more cooperative approach to everything, where everything is really more of a negotiation, to go back to the LBJ style of doing things, that you can exert influence, but do it in a way that's much more based on reason. And people may come around and may not, but ultimately there's an educational value to the reasoning process. All of that reasoning is lost in the noise of the hammer.
There's a Netflix docuseries called Turning Point,
right,
on the Cold War.
Right,
it's fascinating, and the part of this is embedded in how you're oriented and conditioned in the military. But someplace between the only way to deal with a bully is to be a bigger bully. You are no longer entitled to be my leader because of the way you are behaving. All of that starts with the willingness to confront early on.
Right.
Before you get to the headlines that you're talking about.
Right. So I just thought of something funny, which I never thought about bullies as people that basically generate a lot of bullshit. But I think there is some truth to the fact that the other thing that's playing out is there's a lot of bullshit that gets delivered, basically fiction, made up stories, sometimes very creative stories, like what Trump is doing to this judge. A lot of, just making fun, doing stuff that's just bullshit. And I just wonder, when all is said and done, whether we'll get to the point of having a leader as the president of the United States who somehow creates a super role model for all of our children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, because that's what I'm looking for. And I have to tell you, I really hope that person arrives and as soon as possible starts to transform the nation, because we're going to live in a very, very adversarial world in the United States, and maybe in the entire world, if something doesn't start changing in the direction that's much more cooperative.
The global piece is the one, it's an extension of this. Back in February, when Trump basically encouraged Russia, because you didn't pay your bills, I don't care what you do,
right,
for NATO countries,
right,
totally ignoring Title V.
right,
And the movement right now from the European governments to protect themselves in anticipation of Trump winning,
right,
and withdrawing from NATO.
right,
You put yourself in the position of saying, we're the biggest beneficiaries of NATO because we're protected,
right,
by the existence of NATO.
right,
And the fact that we're not paying attention to that, we're going to allow the bully to win.
right. Yep, I agree with you. So on that note, good luck with the article. I think it's a good one, and I think it's a topic that needs to be explored over and over again, and I'm sure it will be. And you look great, so keep up all the good work. You're making it
Yes,
happen.
that single malt for breakfast, the Botox thing.
It works.
Yeah.
It works. Whatever you're doing, just keep doing it because it's working. And you've got a really horrendous travel schedule, I know, because you're always jetting all over the place. So you're doing the right stuff.
It's fun. I woke up in Rome on my birthday.
Oh, good for you. When was that?
With it was the end of January, with the flight attendants saying, "Check around your seats."
Check around.
That was my birthday wish.
What was around your seats?
I got lucky. I had 3 seats.
So
they
allowed you to have a bed in first class.
This is I won't mention the airline, but I'm a lead on a couple of them.
Yeah.
So if I say get any 3 across that he can give me, I usually get them.
Good for you. I got to remember that. I don't have the points that you have, but I'll aspire to get there.
I'll lend you a few.
All right. Thanks. Take care, Tom. Talk to you.
Jack, you take care.
Bye-bye.
Tune in next time on The Valley Current.